Okay, hi everyone. Today I'm really delighted to say hello to Keith Dotson, who you'll know I made a presentation about last month. He joins us today from Nashville. So welcome, Keith. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Um, I'm just going to launch straight in. I've got one of my most favorite images on the screen now of yours. Um, I know that you have very kindly shared so much information with us already. Your website is absolutely brilliant. We can find lots of information there as well. But would you tell us, please, what you think makes a great photograph?
Well, that's a big question, and I have been thinking about that a lot. For me, a great photograph consists of a lot of things. The composition, of course, and the art of the artist, and other things go into it. But to me, it's a photograph that achieves some kind of a goal. Like my goal is I want people to feel an emotion or have some kind of a reaction to my work. And so I think this photo that you pulled up is a good example. I think maybe it's because of the drops, the raindrops, or the dark tones. It causes a reaction in people. It gives them an emotion.
When you say it causes a reaction, is that something that you've actually kind of observed in people? You know, when you show this photograph to people, can you give us a little bit of like a sense of how you've actually observed people observing your work?
Well, most of what I'm basing this on is feedback that people have sent to me, either from seeing my work online or from receiving it, from purchasing it and reaction they've had to it. And that's kind of when I know I've got a really powerful photograph is when they tell me that it gives them feelings. I had someone on Instagram just the other day say that to me, and it was really a great message to receive because that's the kind of thing I love to hear.
Yeah, I mean, you have a really excellent dialogue with your audience, and that you kind of maximize your presence across Instagram, across Facebook. You've got, as I said, a brilliant website. The relationship you have with your audience, is that something that motivates you?
Oh, absolutely. I believe that I probably would not even be a photographer if it wasn't for people, having an audience of people viewing my work. That's really important to me. I'm a businessman and I have to have sales to keep doing this. But part of it is I just love the reaction. And I always have the audience in mind when I'm taking photographs. And I take the photographs for myself, but I always think about how will someone perceive this, or what's the message I'm trying to send, or how do I want them to react?
I mean, you've mentioned that somewhere I was reading that you don't want to make a political statement ever with your work, but there are, of course, many statements
Mhm.
in work that looks like this. Do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Well, I think in a photograph like this, it's very easy just to see it as a picture of a blade of grass with some raindrops on it. But there's more to it. You mentioned it before we started that, I'm an environmentalist, and does that play into it? And it kind of does a little bit, and I'll tell you how. I grew up in Texas, which is a hot place. It rains there, but not a lot. I grew up outside of Austin, so they get rainfall. But I remember probably 10 years ago, there was a famous oil man. Texas is famous for oil. It's a big oil producing state in the world to get oil. But this gentleman said that the next oil boom will actually be about water. And so when I see scenes like this with raindrops, it reminds me that I grew up in a place where it doesn't rain a lot, where water is a precious commodity, and I think that's going to be more true in the future. And so things like that enter my mind, thinking about not only is it beautiful, she has diamonds on the soles of her shoes. It gives me that sort of reaction, but also there's a deeper context, and that's the value of water.
Okay. I mean, these deeper contexts are things that certainly, I mean, both you and I think, as teachers or sometime teachers, are kind of really trying to emphasize to
Mhm.
students, is to really look beyond what is immediate or obvious.
Mhm.
Um, when we look at something as simple as, you say, a blade of grass with some water, commodification of water is a very kind of current trend, a current theme in thinking. Is there anything else environmentally, more kind of globally, that you think your work addresses?
Well, I think anytime I take a photograph in the landscape, I'm thinking about that. You know, Ansel Adams, of course, was famous for being an environmentalist, and I think his work was maybe a little more overt, and he helped, you know, get the national parks really popularized and established. But my work's much more subtle than that. But the base of it for me is I was born in Appalachia, and my father was in the military, so we moved around a lot. But I remember living in the mountains there. It's a beautiful place, very green, very mountainous, just really, really beautiful. But at a very young age, I was riding in the car with my mother, and we were driving around a valley, and across the valley, you could see a mountaintop that had been literally devastated by strip mining. And I asked my mother what's going on there, and she told me that it was a mine. And I couldn't believe that someone had the right to ruin the scenery like that. You know, not to say all the other devastation that I didn't understand at that young age, but just that they could destroy the view by just ripping away part of a mountain. And so that kind of thing is always in the back of my mind. And I think these days, people are pretty far removed from nature. Some people go out to the park, but they don't really go into nature and think about the value of it. And so that's kind of what's really at the root of all my landscape photographs, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to show this photograph. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
really lucky, actually, that you've been so generous to give me some photographs that may not have showed up on a website or been found easily on Google search, for example. This photograph you sent is one that is actually of great importance to you. And that early experience you were describing of riding in the car with your mother, there's a kind of maybe a connection now to this photograph somehow?
Well, this photograph is really probably, I would call it a turning point in my career and in my life. And there may be a connection that you're referring to, but I can tell you why this photograph's important. And you may look at it and say, it's an okay photograph, you know, why would he pull this? But this photograph was taken at kind of a really transformational point in my life. I had gone through a recent divorce, very ugly situation. I was kind of lost in life. I was working as an advertising art director, and that wasn't very creatively satisfying. So in my off hours, which I didn't have a whole lot of free time, but I would do watercolors and pencil drawings and, you know, that kind of art. Photography for me, which I'd always done photography. I learned photography at first in middle school, and I've been doing it ever since I was probably, you know, 12 years old. But it was just a hobby or snapshots or mostly reference for drawings. You know, if I went somewhere beautiful, I'd take a photograph. I'd have my film developed, you know, at the drugstore, and I would have these 4x6 prints that I would tape on my drawing board and use them for a reference. But on this particular trip, because of all the things going on in my life and everything, I just needed to get away. So I went on just a whim trip to Boston one winter over the winter holiday. And I took a bunch of photographs there in a different place than what I was used to, different weather than what I was used to. And when I started looking at them, they, you know, because of the way the camera recorded this, it was almost black and white already. And so I started experimenting around with black and white. And I took a lot of other photos besides this one. They were all part of this process. But this is the first time when I looked at a photograph that I had taken and said, this is actually the art, not the other thing I had been doing. This is what I want to focus on. And if you look at this photograph of this is actually a part of Harvard University. It's a rowing club, and it's a women's rowing club. It's called Weld Boathouse. I don't know the tradition of it or how long it's been there, but I just thought it was really beautiful, the reflection and everything. But the straight on point of view of this building is something I go back to time and again in my work, even today. I think we've got another example of that we might talk about later. But so it was just the experience of making the photographs let me know that that's really what I love. It's being out taking the photographs, not being somewhere doing drawings. And ironically, I was doing pencil drawings with an ebony pencil, very black. My pencil drawings were moving in the direction of the photographs I actually take now as far as the look and feel of them. So it was kind of a weird transition from drawing to photography in that way as well. But this photograph was really kind of a turning point for me in that way. And then probably this was taken in the winter of 2005 or maybe January of 2006, very early. And so I threw myself into photography. And probably a year later, a friend of mine said, well, why don't you put some of these on Etsy and see if anybody will buy them? And I'd never heard of Etsy. So I looked into it and I put a few things out, never imagining that anyone would spend their hard-earned dollars on something I had photographed. But within 3 months, I was having sales. And, you know, they were cheap prints. They were $20 probably or something like that. But it let me know that people are appreciating it in that way, and they will actually open their wallet and buy a print of mine. And that sort of set me on a new course for my life, actually.
I think it's fascinating you describe this transition from being a kind of draftsman, somebody who's drawing and recording that way, into photography, because I'm very used to teaching students across fine art and photography who make the transition around the other way, where their photographs drive drawing.
Right.
But your drawings driving photographing. And actually, you describe working with the ebony pencil. Mm-hmm. What value has drawing given your photographs, do you think?
Well, I think the art side of it and the design side of it both have been really valuable to me from a compositional point of view. I think that having that design background has really helped me in understanding the eye flow through a photograph and things like that. I'm not sure if I had just come, you know, out of an ordinary background with no art training, if I could understand the composition of a photograph as well as I do.
I think this is again a recurring theme for me at the moment, is questioning, like, who is a photographer anyway?
Right. Well, that's funny you say that, because when I took this photograph, I had a very early DSLR. I'd had a little point and shoot digital before that. And as I said, I've been making photographs my entire life, but I didn't really understand f-stops and ISO and all these kind of things. So I was using my DSLR as a point and shoot. I took this scene without any recognition of what the camera settings were. So at this point, I was an artist with a camera. Later on, as I wanted to have more control over what I was shooting, I began to understand, well, you have to adjust this and you have to adjust that to get a certain effect. I became more of an actual photographer, but I hopefully am still a photographer who sees with an artistic eye. But I think that's an interesting thing that you bring up, is, you know, what role is the camera and what role is the art?
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's little separation between those things. I mean, I encounter a lot of, again, students, but also just people who hear that I'm a photography teacher and immediately want to engage with talking about f-stops and ISOs and camera models. And truthfully, personally, for me, that's like the least interesting thing about photography. Simply because the act of seeing is so powerful in its own right.
Absolutely.
I mean, the way you see the world, could you pot it down? How does Keith Dotson see the world? Is it different to the way Keith Dotson sees the world through photographs?
I see the world through a rectangle, if you want to know the truth. Landscape in my mind that I wish I could pull over and shoot. And it's kind of funny because we've got some other photos here. I think I've got this, I'm always looking for subject matter, and I like taking pictures of leaves and flowers, and I have this leaf. And I'm trying to imagine, you know, I think this is really beautiful, you know, the way this thing curls around and all the details. And I'm looking at this and I'm trying to imagine, how would this fit into a rectangle? What's the negative shape going to be like? And I don't think it works, unfortunately. You know, that's a big part of it, is what is this shape and this shape and this shape going to be? And I just don't know if I can make that work. I'm still thinking about it, and I'm looking at it in different kinds of light, trying to see how I can bring out the details, but it may not work.
Is that an awareness that's developed since becoming more interested in photography, though, or is that something that has always been there when you were working, you know, making drawings? You know, were you still thinking in a rectangle then?
Well, as a graphic designer and as a person working on a piece of paper, you always have to think about, what is the negative space? How do you activate that so that it's visually interesting? If you take a picture of something like this leaf and it's floating really small in the middle of a big white sheet of paper, that's not very interesting. But if you crop it so that part of it's removed, or that it's bleeding off the sides or whatever, and positive shapes. And so as a designer, I did that every day. Whether it was typography or photographs or illustrations, you always have to think about that. And so that is definitely something that came forward with me into photography. But now that I tend to see the world in a rectangle, and when I shoot, I compose the image in the camera the way I want it to be. So how it is in the camera frame is how I print it, usually. Very rarely do I ever crop.
I mean, do you do anything else post-production that is like a kind of that would transform the photograph further, or are you quite pure in that you shoot and you print, or you shoot and you present?
Well, there's always post-production that has to be done, but and of course I shoot in color and I convert to black and white, so that's important. But I try to make it as pure as possible because I consider myself kind of photograph to look like a photograph. And I admire, there's a lot of mixed media photography being done where they're sewing into the photograph with a needle and thread and doing all these kind of things. That's really cool. It's just not for me. It's not how I express myself. I want to, and I'm not a documentary photographer. I don't mean that, but I want it to look as it is in the world. That's kind of.
I mean, looking as it is in the world is possibly connected to your sense of strong connection to nature, I guess. Like, how could any of us better what nature gives us already, I guess?
Exactly. In fact, I think it was Gary Winogrand who said that your challenge is how do you take something that's beautiful, whether it's something that's really beautiful, and make a photograph that's just as beautiful or more beautiful. It's a challenge.
Yeah. Also, the kind of like the value we put on ownership of things, I think, is really interesting for us as photographers, because we're just recording, aren't we?
Right.
We're bringing a record of something that's already magnificent to an audience that can see that magnificence maybe for themselves anyway. What qualifies you as the photographer, or more broadly, any photographer indeed?
The only thing that qualifies you to be a photographer or an artist is that you say that you are one. That's all I can say. And your work will rise to the top or it won't. But I mean, I believe in just doing things. I think if you have a passion for it, you'll bring people along. But as far as deciding what is the valuable moment in life, that's part of your job. And actually, it's easy to look at a photograph and say, this was such a brilliant thing that I did. But honestly, there are probably 200 frames after that didn't work. This is the one that you captured that really worked. And that's part of it too. You have to do that work.
Yeah, I mean, you've talked already about how drawing influenced your photographs. How do you think teaching has influenced your photographs?
Well, teaching forces you to think about the right words to express it. Talking about, which means you have to really look at something in a different way. A lot of photography and a lot of art is instinctual. You do things because you have this sort of innate sense of composition, or you have an interest in, if you like to draw pictures of horses, you have a lot of understanding of horses, but how do you describe to someone how to make a drawing of a horse? Or how do you describe to someone how to make a photograph that have an emotion? You have to think that through, and that's what I think. You're teaching someone, you're also teaching yourself. And when they ask questions, you learn a lot,
Yeah, I mean, I definitely learn more than I was ever actively taught through teaching and listening to my students, what they bring up, what they say, so kind of profound they don't mean to be.
Right.
And I'm very aware that in my role as a teacher or a facilitator, I could just be, I'm pretty passive in that role. The real learning is actually happening because of a kind of something else, or a union between perhaps what I suggest, but really under their own steam, under that photographer, whoever they are, they're a student or they're an established photographer, it's under their own steam of simply seeing.
Yeah, you have to do the work yourself to really improve. But I think you're not giving yourself enough credit. I mean, the fact that you're doing this is probably a lot than most teachers do. And I think what you're doing is amazing. And so on this photograph we're looking at right now, this is a pretty simple photograph on the surface. It's a picture of a leaf, piece of paper with a direct shadow. What I was interested in here is showing the structure of it and how beautiful something that you walk past every day would be. I mean, in the autumn, you walk by thousands of these every day. But every leaf is kind of like a fingerprint. It looks individual, and the way they curl when they dry and everything, just like this one I was showing a minute ago, they're all unique. But what's the backstory of this photograph is that this is not a single photograph This is probably about 6 photographs because it's a macro photograph, and I used a macro lens, and I was very close to this leaf, which means that when the tip of the stem was in focus, 1 inch down the photograph was out of focus, and the other side of the photograph was way out of focus. So I shot this 6 times, if I remember correctly, focusing on different parts of the leaf. And then in Photoshop, I recomposed them into one image so that you have, oh, no one cares. But as a photographer, this is how you make a decision. In the other photograph we looked at with the blade of grass, a lot of that's out of focus. I wanted it to be that way. I wanted to kind of have that magical feel, that sort of dimensional feel of coming out of the distance. This one, I wanted everything to be in focus, and that's why I did it that way.
I'm absolutely shocked and amazed to hear that it's composed from different photographs. I mean, the quality of the texture is something in your work that I find really breathtakingly beautiful. It's something that when talking to the students, it was really a focus for us, was thinking about texture, surface, and how to bring that out. I'm never going to live down that I didn't know that you actually haven't just shot once and made that happen, that and everybody just make sure you really do understand that this is not just a single photograph. I mean, to me, this looks like a Ruskin drawing. You know, it's transportingly beautiful. It's so delicate.
Thank you. I appreciate that. This is I think I mentioned to you in my notes that this is one that I've gotten eggs on Instagram where people have used this as a reference, and they've made drawings and watercolor, all kinds of art that have come from this simple leaf, which I just find so flattering and amazing that people are inspired by it. You know, it's mostly students who are just learning, and that's great. They've interpreted it in different ways.
Absolutely. The interpretation of this is, you know, manifold. We could look at it simply as the form. There's an exploration of something that's ordinary that is then extraordinary. There's a kind of supernatural quality to it. I mean, you talked about magic. I'm just going to go back on my slides to that very first one again, this mystical nature, something emerging. I can really see that, sense that in a lot of your work actually, but in this one it has its own magic. When you made it, because such a thought, you know, a lot of thought has gone into it, did you think, well, what did you think it would be?
I thought it was a beautiful leaf that I wanted to try to capture. There's a famous thing, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Julia Margaret Cameron photograph of the, what's it called, the nymph or something like that. Yeah. It's a portrait of a girl taken in the 1860s, and her face looks like it's coming out of the paper. And she sent this print to her friend John Herschel, who invented this. He said is she looks like she's a sculpture. She's coming off the paper. And that's what I wanted to do here. I want this leaf to almost look like it can just blow away if a breeze comes through. Yeah. But I also wanted, one thing about being in business as an artist is I get a lot of requests for very large prints. I never expected this, but interior designers and people working with commercial properties, they want large wall size. And I love the idea of this leaf, which is only this big, being 60 inches tall on someone's wall. You know, it turns into a landscape of its own at that size. You know, those little ridges in the leaf become a landscape, and I like that.
I'm sorry to jump a slide actually, but just what you're saying is really relevant here as well. When you sent me these photographs, again, I hadn't actually seen these as part of your work anywhere because I've been so focused on your work with nature. Right. You put the words dignity and power, and that is something that, you know, if I was to think about a collection of words, chuck some words at the stuff you see, dignity and power, I could give dignity and power to really any of your photographs of nature.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. That's what I would want to have happen.
Is that kind of, you know, I'm sure it wouldn't be offensive, but nonetheless, it might not be what you're going for. But with these ones, just to think specifically about these images, these kind of banal, ordinary objects, why do you choose to elevate them?
Well, in this case, it's really very similar to what I do with the nature photographs. I want these objects, which are quite ordinary, to have an elevated place visually. And what I'm trying to do here, and a lot of this came happening. We realize in the United States, and maybe you had the same experience, that ventilators, medications, all these kind of things that we really needed, we had to get from foreign countries. We don't make these things in the United States anymore, which is crazy. And I was thinking about the fact that back in the day, not only did we make these tools in the United States, the tools were used in the United States to make other things in the United States we no longer make. And I was thinking about, like, speaking of coming from Nashville, in Nashville, they had places that would actually make tractor parts and all these kind of things that now are only made maybe in one place in the United States, if at all. But in those days, you could get it made locally. Every city had this kind of thing. People were making things with their hands, and these tools were an important part. Well, that's part of the thought process behind these. But also, if you're a guy who works with these wrenches, maybe you're a plumber or whatever, this is not an art object to you. It's a tool. Probably the last thing you think about when you see this is a beautiful thing. But I look at these and I see them as very practical, but they're also quite beautiful objects among themselves. First of all, like I have one here. I mean, look at the shape of this. Mm. It's done that way because it's easier to use, but it's also just gorgeous. And talking about the negative shape in the rectangle, I love that. A lot of them have names on them or initial scratching them, which gives you a direct connection maybe to 70 years ago when someone actually used this. And they were on a work site and they didn't want to get infused with someone else's tools, So I like that aspect of it. Same with the architecture photographs, the abandoned houses. I like to think about the people who were there.
We're just going to go back to that one because this is the one that we skipped over.
Right.
Forgotten. You put that word in the title of this work. Are these things forgotten? I mean, are you concerned for them, and that's why you draw our attention to them?
Well, I think a lot of them are forgotten. You're referring to my book title, Unloved and Forgotten, but I think a lot of these places are forgotten. And why that matters to me is that if you think about a house, or in this case, this is a school, and there's a story behind this building I'll tell you about if you want to hear it. But, people lived in these places, they worked in these places, they were alive with energy. And somewhere along the way, people left and never went back. The maintenance stopped, and slowly but surely the buildings start going back to nature. And I just find that remarkable because it tells you, I think one thing that runs through almost all my work is this sense of the transience of everything. Nothing lasts. I have, it's kind of ironic, but if I print a photograph right now with pigment inks on cotton paper, it will last 400 years, theoretically, which is longer than most of these buildings will last. If you think about it that way, it's kind of ironic. But this particular building, you'll notice it's, again, straight on view, just like the boathouse, which I tend to prefer. And when I'm looking at this, first of all, I want to talk about the composition. I'm a lot of times thinking in terms of pure shapes. So if you look at this, we have the yard, which is a rectangle, maybe a 30 or 40% gray. This is maybe a fifth or a sixth of the frame. And then you have the trees, which is darker. It's a large rectangle, maybe 4/5 of the frame. Then in the center, we have a polygon or a pentagon or a rectangle with some triangles, however you want to look at that. More rectangles inside, some horizontal lines, and then of course the trees are vertical. I look at all this kind of thing when I'm composing this. It's in my mind, how is this going to look, in the rectangle? But then on top of it, you add in the weathering, and you identify texture as a big part of my work. Texture is all about what my work is. I love texture. So the texture of this wood grain and of those bricks and how the weathering has affected it really gives me excitement. But then on top of it, this building is a school. It's located in the state of Alabama, which is in the American South, not far from where I live. And it's had a lot of controversial race things happen throughout the generations, still today. This is an African-American school. It was built, I think, around 1900 or maybe a little earlier, segregated. So this was in a community where the white kids had to go here and the African-American kids had to go here. But yet they took a lot of pride in that. they built this for their children. They wanted their children to have education. It was important. So there's a lot of, I think, emotion and energy in this building. And when you go and like stand on the porch and look inside, it's just an empty room, but you can sense that. And I always think when I'm in an abandoned building, I can kind of feel, maybe not ghosts, but the spirit of people who were there before. It's almost like you have eyes on you, or they know you're there and they're telling you honor this place in a way, which is what I try to do.
I mean, the residue of that energy, I would apply that actually even to a dying or decaying flower. I would apply the same energy to the water. Your work is infused with energetic resonance somehow. But, you know, you as the photographer, or rather, no, you as Keith Dotson in the place and space with these things, whatever they are, you may be able to feel them, but how come you can so successfully convey that to us through these photographs?
I don't know if I can answer that question. I mean, it's a goal of mine to try to do that, and I try to honor that. And some of this has to do with the light, for example. I got really lucky with the light in this particular photograph, and I have a certain kind of light that I prefer, especially for landscapes. I'm probably the only photographer you'll ever meet who wants a gloomy day or a rainy day or a cloudy day. Everyone else wants a beautiful sunrise or sunset or some color, or I like flat gray light. And then I can control to a certain extent the way the contrast works. But I think that gloomy light helps with the mood, and maybe it helps convey that a little bit. I'm not sure.
I mean, it's very similar to me when you think about like Ansel Adams with his zoning system.
Yes.
You described earlier when you first started talking about this kind of compositionally, or the link between the composition and the light, or the quality of tone. You have huge segments that you devote and kind of declare as different qualities of tone. I'm just wondering how, you know, in post-production, how did you play with tone in post-production with an image like this, where you were then aware of this quality of light anyway?
Every step of the photograph is important. You know, you go, like, I spend a lot of time driving and traveling to go to places like this and finding them. And sometimes I find them by accident, and sometimes I go there as a destination. So shooting the photograph is important. You know, selecting the right photograph is important. Processing the photographs important, and printing the photographs important. They're all equally important. And so I spend a lot of time, like on this particular one. I also shot multiple views of this building, but this is my favorite. But I spend a lot of time in how I convert these to black and white and how much texture is appropriate. And when you use black and white a lot, and the reason I shoot color images is because when you're doing the conversion process, a yellow is going to look a little different in black and white than red or blue. And you learn how to assess, like the lawn here. If it's green, it's going to transfer to black and white a little differently than if it's dead grass and it's yellow. The trees will look a little different if they have leaves on them. You know, these kind of things. I'm always thinking about that. But the light is something you can't do much with. If the light's not right, it's very difficult. And I struggle with this because I live in a sunny place. And summertime is very hard for me to shoot this kind of image because there's just so much harsh daylight.
I mean, in the original series of questions that I forwarded to you in preparation for this talk, I asked you on this slide, actually, are you a minimalist? But I wonder if I could change my question a little bit, which is that that actually, do you think that you could align yourself with minimalism, in that there's almost like or rather like a voluntary state of poverty? There's something quite ancient and passive, yes, giving up to the essence or the scene of a place, or the sense of a thing. And in that sense, are you a minimalist?
I see where you're going with that. I think I would agree with that. I mean, I prefer minimalist photography anyways. And landscapes are extreme, and everything can create a lot of visual noise. You have to be very careful about. But, you know, talking about, do you record something, or, you know, how do you interpret it? In a case like this, you set your camera up and you let the subject just communicate to you. You you know, and in that way, I think I am a minimalist. But I also know the subjects that I prefer. You know, this as a new interest in that, it's not a real estate ad, it's something else. And the fact that it has the backstory with the African American schools and all that, it makes it even more significant to me. That's the thing that I really love. And anytime I go to an abandoned building or any landscape, I try to find out what's the story of that place, because to me, that's an important part. Even though no one looking at this may ever know unless they read something I've written about it, it's still important.
This image went in the book, did it? This was in the book?
This was not in the book.
Okay.
This was taken after the book, I think.
When you, that again, you know, there's whole layers to storytelling in photographs. So it kind of strikes me that maybe it's not important to you that people know the whole story, but that they have enough information to guess at a story.
I want people to be interested in the story, whether they know the story or not. I want them to look at this building and have curiosity. And maybe find out. And I'm willing to tell anyone the story if I know it. I love for people to know the story. In fact, one of the reasons I started researching things is because, you know, when you're promoting your work on Facebook, for example, people tend to just go out and drop an image on Facebook, and you're going through Facebook and there's a picture. Okay. It feels very superficial to me to just drop a photograph of anything out there without giving some reason for it to exist. I want people to know why did I take this photo? What's important about it? They may just scan through and say, oh, that's a cool photo. But hopefully they'll be more interested than that.
Yeah, I was going to say to me, for somebody who's applying so much kind of preparatory thought in what they do, it's not enough just to see. You do want people to feel, absolutely. You said right at the start, you want people to spark an emotion, or your photograph to spark an emotion in them. I mean, when we look at, again, coming back to these, like the emotion that you expect, does it perplex you ever when people don't feel what you expect them to?
Oh, absolutely. I'm perplexed every day by things that people like that I didn't expect them to like, or the way they interpret things. And it's kind of funny when someone talks to you about your work and they've gone way off in a different direction than you expected, you know? But that's okay. That's what art is for.
I'm going to really kind of pincer in on that. What is art for?
It's for people to take however they choose to take it. It's for them to interpret. I mean, I like to tell the story of something, but I don't want to tell someone how to feel or how to interpret anything.
Yeah, I find this so interesting, because your work is full of feeling for me, but then equally I'm aware that somebody else standing next to me may not feel, certainly they may feel something, but they might not feel exactly the same as me. Sometimes when I show my own work, I can find it quite challenging that somebody doesn't engage with it in the way I expect.
Right.
And I think through becoming more of a photographer, I've had to learn how to let go of my images. I mean, do you feel that the relationship you have with your images is about letting them go out into the ether, out into the universe?
You have to learn to do and some lot of time, and you have an investment emotionally in something to, first of all, putting your work out there is a big step.
Keith, can I?
And this is something that we are.
I'm so sorry. Just when you started responding, we cut out and I couldn't hear anything. And I think what you said is probably very important. Would you mind repeating it?
Sure. I was just saying that I think putting your work out on the internet is a big step. Exposing yourself to potential ridicule or questions, or you don't know what's going to happen. You know, I remember it's the same thing when I put my work on Etsy. I didn't know if people were going to buy it or ask me, why are you on here with this terrible work? I didn't know what was going to happen. So there is a certain amount of letting go that has to happen. And when you release it out there, you don't know how people are going to respond, you know, whether they're going to, sometimes you put your work out there and it gets no reaction.
Mm.
and you've done all this work and you think it's powerful and it just kind of gets a yawn, that's not flattering either, you know. But I've, and here's a curious thing. Instagram rules the world these days, and you have to be very careful that you don't make your work to Instagram and to getting people to react to it there, that it's not your work anymore, if that makes any sense.
Just clarify that.
What I mean is the algorithm prefers certain things and people will respond to certain things. Like I've noticed that images that have a lot of black and are very contrasty, people pay a lot more attention. Sometimes that's the way I work, and I have to be very careful that I'm not shooting and processing things just to get Instagram likes rather than the way I would do it for other reasons. And it's kind of interesting because as a businessman, I post my work on Instagram, and honestly, Instagram's not that important to me as a business person. Pinterest is where all my web traffic comes from. And I can post something on Pinterest and the same thing on Instagram and get totally different. But Pinterest drives traffic to my website. And I don't do anything on Pinterest. I just put it out there and people like it or they don't. But if they like it, they go to the website. Whereas Instagram, you're chasing likes, you're chasing comments, and it's a fine line. You have to be very careful.
Mm. But it doesn't, Instagram doesn't make a photographer, really. I mean, this is me putting my personal slant on it.
Yes, I
Uh,
agree with that.
yeah, I'm just thinking about this sense that, you know, you're shooting things that are full of life. Each thing we encounter in your portfolio is full of uh, energy. You said that word. You're giving us stories. You're creating a space in which an audience can participate in what they see through um, kind of like a hybrid between your expected narrative or the actual narrative and then what is perceived by the audience. And yet, you know, we know that photographs are the ultimate dead art. How does that sit with you?
By dead art, in that it's just a two-dimensional object, or what do you mean by that?
Well, and as soon as we make the photograph, the thing is closed. It's kept and suspended forever. It's kind of, you know, in one way, I guess we could say that something that was vibrant can't maintain or retain a vibrancy in its closed form as a photograph, that there's something essentially sad, melancholy in a photograph. Do you think there's a lot of melancholy in your work anyway, actually?
I think there is, and I've gotten that feedback.
I mean, to me, that makes it even more beautiful.
Just, you know, everyone has things in their life, you know, that makes them blue or melancholy. And I've had that, and some of that comes through my work. Some of it, I just think it's beautiful like that. Some of my work is radiant with light, and I'm trying to adapt to that more these days because I live in a sunny climate and it's easier to shoot in the sun if you're willing to accept that kind of, you know, bright kind of thing. But like the photograph we're looking at now, I love this dark, gloomy look to it. And I think it adds dimensionality and it adds mystery, and it makes it emotional. And the fact that the thing is sort of withered. In fact, I was working on an exhibition one time, and the people that own the space asked me if I had color photos because the black and white were too depressing. And I was like, I don't have color, I'm sorry. So I have gotten that feedback on occasion, but that's okay. You know, it is what
Yeah,
it is.
I don't know if you heard me saying, I think it maybe glitched again, but actually any perceived melancholy in your work to me makes it even more beautiful.
Mm.
I mean, I know you've seen some of my other interviews, and you probably know that I've spoken to everyone already about this idea of quietness. There's an equation for me between quietness and thoughtfulness. When I look at your work, I see a photographer who's being very still and present with what they see. And I feel I understand the presence of the object as something that is transportingly beautiful in its own right, and that takes me beyond the frame into the space the frame creates. So a wonderful interplay between life and death, darkness and light, all those big things that we might talk about with photographs or indeed any image. But if you were to try and encapsulate it for us, it's really maybe too difficult to say, but what is the Keith Dotson style?
That is a tough question to answer. I think you just have to look at the work to see that.
Mm.
I mean, I think what you're identifying here, interpret that as sort of calm and almost like a Zen quality. That's what I'm going for, is I want people to have a sort of sense of peace and Zen when they look at images like this. But I'm just trying to get at some essence, you know, the spirit and the essence of a thing or a place. And, you know, my thing is that I think black and white photography does usually, you know, that's a big statement and it may not be true in all cases, but I think black and white photography has a way of cutting through unnecessary information and bringing out the truth of a certain subject. And that's why I love it. And so I guess if you have to ask me about my work, that's what I would say, is I'm trying to show the essence of things in a truthful way.
I mean, specifically about nature. Again, you know this already from watching the presentation I did for students when we were trying to copy your water droplet on leaves work. How does your personal relationship with nature inform what we see?
Well, I think first of all, you know, one of the reasons I stopped doing drawings and started doing photography is because I love camera. You take it with you and it goes where you go. So I don't know if I would be a photographer if it wasn't for being out in nature and experiencing it. But, you know, when you're out hiking or when you're experiencing, and I don't mean necessarily being somewhere like Monument Valley where there's this big landscape that overwhelms you. I try to experience this, like in this photograph, in a small way wherever I go, because there is beauty all around us. And I see things like this little blade of a leaf or grass or whatever, this natural form of sculpture that's just waiting to be observed. And so, and there's a certain sense of well-being that you get from being out in nature that I think more and more as people are not going out or they're going out less, that they're missing. And I'm trying to bring that to them in a way. And the same with the ecology. I want people to remember that nature is important. We had a controversy last year where some of our national monuments were being taken away so that essentially so they could do mining on the properties. And I want people to not feel good about that.
Does that mean that there's a mournfulness anyway in your work? Is there a mournfulness in your photographs of nature? Is there a kind of residue of regret? Not necessarily your regret, but that there's a sense that we, the audience, should be aware of how much we ought to regret what we do to nature.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely at the essence of it. And it goes back to what I said about that strip mining on the mountainside. You know, there's a disbelief there that we can do this kind of thing. And it goes a lot deeper than strip mining on a mountainside, because in addition to strip mining the mountainside, the poisonous things trickle down the mountain and pollute the water supply. So there's a, you know, there's an aesthetic part of it, and then there's a very real direct health problem part of it. And it's well known that when you spend time in nature, that it calms you and it helps your blood pressure. And of course you get exercise. And when you're in nature, you value nature. And if you don't go to nature, you know, if you're an 11-year-old kid and all you do is play video games indoors and you never go anywhere where you experience this kind of presence in nature, how do you value it later when people are talking about destroying it? And it's a very real concern of mine, because we're doing it in the United States right now and elsewhere. And, you know, the photographer, Edward Bertinsky, his work is all about that. I don't know if you've ever looked at his large scale photographs. They're beautiful in their own way, but he documents places where rivers are poisoned by mines, or, you know, there's large scale devastation. And that's what his work is all about. And I just think it's important for us to remember that we can't do that.
Well, Keith Dotson, it's been such a pleasure listening to you talking about your work. And
Thank you for the invitation. It was a lot of fun.
well, thank you for giving me your time. Thank you for giving your time to my students. And I think you know this, but I think your work is beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Bye. All right. Hopefully the audio is good.